Robert Louis Stevenson, The Sea Fox, narrated by Howard King. A change in the color of the light usually called me in the morning. By a certain hour, the long vertical chinks in our western gable, where the boards had shrunk and separated, flashed suddenly into my eyes as stripes of dazzling blue, at once so dark and splendid that I used to marvel how the qualities could be combined. At an earlier hour, the heavens in that quarter were still quietly colored, but the shoulder of the mountain, which shuts in the canyon, already glowed with sunlight in a wonderful compound of gold and rose and green. And this too would kindle, although more mightily, with rainbow tints, the fissures of our crazy gable. If I were sleeping heavily, it was the bold blue that struck me awake. If more lightly, then I would come to myself in that earlier and fairer light. One Sunday morning, about 5, the first brightness called me. I rose and turned to the east, not for my devotions, but for air. The night had been very still. The little private gale that blew every evening in our canyon for 10 minutes or perhaps a quarter of an hour had swiftly blown itself out. In the hours that followed, not a sigh of wind had shaken the treetops, and our barrack, for all its breaches, was less fresh that morning than of wont. But I had no sooner reached the window than I forgot all else and the sight that met my eyes, and I made out 2 bounds into my clothes and down the crazy plank to the platform. The sun was still concealed below the opposite hilltops, though it was shining already, not 20 feet above my head, on our own mountain slope. But the scene, beyond a few near features, was entirely changed. Napa Valley was gone. Gone were all the lower slopes and woody foothills of the range. And in their place, not 1,000 feet below me, rolled a great level ocean. It was as though I had gone to bed the night before, safe in a nook of inland mountains, and had awakened in a bay upon the coast. I had seen these inundations from below. At Calistoga I had risen and gone abroad in the early morning, coughing and sneezing, under fathoms on fathoms of grey sea vapor, like a cloudy sky, a dull sight for the artist, and a painful experience for the invalid. But to sit aloft oneself in a pure air and under the unclouded dome of heaven, and thus look down on the submergence of the valley, was strangely different and even delightful to the eyes. Far away were hilltops like little islands. Nearer, a smoky surf beat about the foot of precipices and poured into all the coves of these rough mountains. The color of that fog ocean was a thing never to be forgotten. For an instant, among the Hebrides, and just about sundown, I've seen something like it on the sea itself, but the white was not so opaline. Nor was there what surprisingly increased the effect, that breathless crystal stillness all over. Even in its gentlest moods, the salt sea travails, moaning among the weeds or lisping on the sand. But that vast fog ocean lay in a trance of silence, nor did the sweet air of the morning tremble with the sound. As I continued to sit upon the dump, I began to observe that the sea was not so level as at first sight it appeared to me. Away in the extreme south, a little hill of fog arose against the sky above the general surface, and as it had already caught the sun, it shone on the horizon like the topsails of some giant ship. There were huge waves, stationary as it seemed, like waves in a frozen sea. And yet, as I looked again, I was not sure, but they were moving after all, with a slow and august advance. And while I was yet doubting, a promontory of the hills, some 4 or 5 miles away, conspicuous by a bouquet of tall pines, was in a single instant overtaken and swallowed up. It reappeared in a little with its pines, but this time as an islet, and only to be swallowed up once more, and then for good. This set me looking nearer, and I saw that in every cove along the line of mountains, the fog was being piled in higher and higher, as though by some wind that was inaudible to me. I could trace its progress, one pine tree first growing hazy and then disappearing after another, although sometimes there was none of this forerunning haze, but the whole opaque, white ocean gave a start and swallowed a piece of mountain at a gulp. It was to flee these poisonous fogs that I had left the seaboard and climbed so high among the mountains. And now, behold, here came the fog to besiege me in my chosen altitudes, and yet came so beautifully that my first thought was of welcome. The sun had now gotten much higher, and through all the gaps of the hills it cast long bars of gold across that wide ocean. An eagle or some other very great bird of the mountain came wheeling over the nearer pine tops and hung poised and something sideways, as if to look abroad on that unwonted desolation, spying, perhaps with terror, for the eyries of her comrades. Then, with a long cry, she disappeared again toward Lake County and the clear air. At length, it seemed to me as if the flood was beginning to subside. The old landmarks by whose disappearance I had measured its advance, here a crag, there a brave pine tree, now began in the adverse order to make their reappearance into daylight. I judged all danger of the fog was over. This was not a Noah's flood. It was but a morning spring, and would now drift out seaward whence it came. So mightily relieved and a good deal exhilarated by the sight, I went into the house to light the fire. I suppose it was nearly 7 when I once more mounted the platform to look abroad. The fog ocean had swelled up enormously since last I saw it, and a few 100 feet below me, in a deep gap, where a toll house stands and the road runs through into Lake County. It had already topped the slope and was pouring over and down the other side like driving smoke. The wind had climbed along with it, and though I was still in calm air, I could see the trees tossing below me, and a long strident sighing mounted to me where I stood. Half an hour later, the fog had surmounted all the ridge on the opposite side of the gap, though a shoulder of the mountain still warded it out of our canyon. Napa Valley and its bounding hills were now utterly blotted out. The fog, sunny white, and the sunshine was pouring over into Lake County in a huge, ragged cataract, tossing treetops appearing and disappearing in the spray. The air struck with a little chill and set me coughing. It smelled strong of the fog, like the smell of a washing house, but with a shrewd tang of the sea salt. Had it not been for two things, the sheltering spur, which answered as a dike, and the great valley on the other side, which rapidly engulfed whatever mounted, our own little platform in the canyon must have been already buried 100 feet in salt and poisonous air. As it was, the interest of the scene entirely occupied our minds. We were set just out of the wind, and but just above the fog. We could listen to the voice of the one as to the music on the stage. We could plunge our eyes down into the other as into some flowing stream from over the parapet of a bridge. Thus we looked on upon a strange, impetuous, silent, shifting exhibition of the powers of nature, and saw the familiar landscape changing from moment to moment, like figures in a dream. The imagination loves to trifle with what is not. Had this been indeed a deluge, I should have felt more strongly, but the emotion would have been similar in kind. I played with the idea as the child flies in delighted terror from the creations of his fancy. The look of the thing helped me, and when at last I began to flee up the mountain, it was indeed partly to escape from the raw air that kept me coughing, but it was also part in play. As I ascended the mountainside, I came once more to overlook the upper surface of the fog. But it wore a different appearance from what I had beheld at daybreak. For first the sun now fell on it from high overhead, and its surface shone and undulated like a great Norland moor country, sheeting with untrodden morning snow. And next, the new level must have been 1,000 or 1,500 feet higher than the old, so that only 5 or 6 points of all the broken country below me still stood out. Napa Valley was now one with Sonoma on the west. On the hither side, only a thin, scattered fringe of bluffs was unsubmerged, and through all the gaps the fog was pouring over like an ocean into the blue, clear, sunny country on the east. There it was soon lost, for it fell instantly into the bottom of the valleys, following the watershed, and the hilltops in that quarter were still clear cut upon the eastern sky. Through the Tall House Gap and over the near ridges on the other side, the deluge was immense. A spray of thin vapor was thrown high above it, rising and falling, and blown into fantastic shapes. The speed of its course was like a mountain torrent. Here and there a few treetops were discovered and then whelmed again, and for 1 second the bough of a dead pine beckoned out of the spray like the arm of a drowning man. But still the imagination was dissatisfied, still the ear waited for something more. Had this indeed been water, as it seemed so to the eye, with what a plunge of reverberating thunder would it have rolled upon its course, disemboweling mountains and deracinating pines, and yet water it was, and sea water at that, true Pacific billows, only somewhat rarefied, rolling in mid-air among the hilltops. I climbed still higher among the red rattling gravel and dwarf underwood of Mount St. Helena, until I could look right down upon Silverado and admire the favored nook in which it lay. The sunny plain of fog was several hundred feet higher behind the protecting spur, a gigantic accumulation of cottony vapor threat with every second to blow over and submerge our homestead. But the vortex setting past the tall house was too strong, and there lay our little platform, in the arms of the deluge, but still enjoying its unbroken sunshine. About 11, however, thin spray came flying over the friendly buttress, and I began to think the fog had hunted out its Jonah after all. But it was the last effort. The wind veered while we were at dinner, and it began to blow squally from the mountain summit, and by 1:30, all that world of sea fogs was utterly rooted and flying here and there into the south in little rags of cloud. And instead of a lone sea beach, we found ourselves once more inhabiting a high mountainside, with a clear green country far below us and the light smoke of Calistoga blowing in the air. This was the great Russian campaign for that season. Now and then, in the early morning, a little white lakelet of fog would be seen far down in Napa Valley, but the heights were not again assailed, nor was the surrounding world again shut off from Silverado.